They vanished without warning. From sidewalks, bedrooms, highways, and parking lots. 33 people, tied together by nothing except the silence they left behind. No last calls. No goodbyes. Just abandoned cars, half-eaten dinners, and a question no one can answer. This isn't true crime. It's not closure. It's the sound of a door closing and never opening again. Welcome to 33 Missing People Mysteries from the forgotten corners of the West, where people disappear and the desert forgets to care. You're not supposed to get comfortable. You're supposed to wonder. Let's begin. Before we dive headfirst into the unknown, quick pause. If you're into unsettling disappearances, eerie silences, and stories that never wrap up neatly, hit subscribe. It keeps this series alive and just might help some of these names stay remembered. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? What time is it where you are? Midnight in Ohio? 3 a.m. in Melbourne? Let's see who's out here chasing mysteries instead of sleep. All right, lights off, volume up, let's get lost. Patricia Pat Weeks. There are women who vanish like vapor. And then there's Pat Weeks, who didn't just disappear. She evaporated into a narrative that refuses to stay still. In 1968, Patricia Pat Weeks was 38 years old, married, and living in Las Vegas with her husband, Robert Weeks. On paper, their life looked unremarkable, the kind of domestic setup that usually escapes notice, unless someone ends up dead. Robert was a real estate investor and former professor. Pat, by contrast, was the kind of woman people described in polite but vague terms. Quiet, nice, kept to herself, that kind of thing. Not much is recorded about her personality, which is strange. Usually, when someone disappears, the retrospectives start pouring in. She loved animals, she was a good cook, she had a quick laugh. But Pat, she was a ghost even before she left the room. In October of that year, Pat and Robert reportedly had a falling out. Details are scarce, but the story goes, she decided to leave. They were driving, somewhere on the outskirts of Vegas, when Pat allegedly told Robert she'd had enough of the marriage, enough of him, and wanted out of the car. According to Robert, she got out on the side of the highway and walked off, just like that. If you're already squinting at the logic, you're not alone. The Nevada desert is not exactly pedestrian-friendly. You don't just walk away from a car on a desert highway in 1968 and leave no trace unless someone else ensures there won't be one. Pat was never seen again. She didn't pick up her belongings. She didn't check in with friends or family. No missing person flyer with a cheerful, "Have you seen her?" smile ever made the rounds. In fact, it seems no one filed an official missing persons report for quite a while. No serious investigation unfolded. The system didn't blink. And Robert? Robert moved on eventually, quite literally. He remarried. Years passed. People forgot. Until, of course, Robert showed up in the headlines again. Not for a reunion. Not for a revelation. But for a murder. Decades after Pat vanished, Robert Weeks was convicted of killing his third wife. By then, he was elderly, retired, and living in Idaho. Apparently, the quiet professor turned real estate tycoon had a darker hobby, watching the women in his life vanish, either by disappearance or death. And suddenly, Pat's vanishing didn't look like a marital spat anymore. It looked like a blueprint. But here's where things get messy. Robert never confessed to Pat's disappearance. He never hinted at involvement, never slipped up, never said too much, not even after being convicted of a completely separate murder. In fact, by the time anyone tried to connect dots, most of the dots had faded. Evidence? Gone. Witnesses? Dead or missing. Memory? Corrupted by time. And so, Pat Weeks remains a blank space. No body, no leads, no crime scene, not even a confirmed crime. Just a husband who'd later kill again, and a wife who stepped off the road and into the void. And really, what can you do with that? The absence of evidence becomes the evidence of absence. The silence becomes a scream. It's easy, maybe even comforting, to imagine Pat in a different life. Maybe she staged her own disappearance. Maybe she escaped something we'll never know. Maybe she's sipping coffee somewhere in Peru under a new name, reading about Robert's conviction with a quiet smirk. Maybe. But more likely, she ended up as so many do, lost between two versions of herself, the one who wanted to leave, and the one who was never allowed to. And just when you start to settle into that theory, another woman steps into frame. Another Vegas disappearance. Another woman with plans that never unfolded. Cynthia R. Jabbour. Different year, different name, same inexplicable vacuum. Because in this city of lights, women don't just vanish, they're folded into the margins, one after the other, until the story stops being about the women at all. Cynthia R. Jabbour. On a warm September evening in 1980, Cynthia Jabbour told friends she was going to meet a man she'd recently met. He was described only as wealthy, possibly influential, and depending on which version of the story you hear, either connected to high society or deeply entangled in something far more subterranean. She was 38, confident, independent, and by all accounts, capable of handling herself. Cynthia was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and own it. She didn't scare easy. But what Cynthia didn't know, or maybe what she suspected and underestimated, was that in Las Vegas, power doesn't wear a name tag. It doesn't show up with a gun. It doesn't need to. It simply disappears you and lets time do the rest. That night, Cynthia left for her meeting. She didn't say exactly where she was going. She didn't come back. She didn't call. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't leave a note. And she didn't vanish into thin air, not really. She vanished into the narrative void Las Vegas keeps open like a trap door, right between the promises and the secrets. The investigation, if you can call it that, unfolded like a badly written screenplay. A few questions were asked. A few acquaintances were interviewed. The wealthy man she was supposed to meet? Unidentified. No trace of him. No record of the meeting. No surveillance. Though, to be fair, this was 1980. Cameras weren't watching every corner yet. Sometimes, people really could just walk away from everything and leave behind only a handful of cigarette butts and guesses. Except, Cynthia wasn't the type. She had plans. She had friends who knew her schedule. She was close with her family. She hadn't spoken of fear, of escape, of wanting to start over. There were no signs. Only silence. Years passed. Every few years, her name would show up on a list. Cold cases, missing persons, women gone without a trace. A reporter once dug into it, published a few paragraphs in a now defunct paper, tying her case to a string of disappearances that seemed to orbit the same kind of man. Rich, charming, anonymous. That piece barely made it out of the editorial basement. No follow-ups. No renewed efforts. Just another unsolved vanishing, dropped into the open desert air, where it dried out with everything else. If there was a pattern, no one was in a hurry to find it. Or worse, maybe they did, and they didn't like what it pointed to. And this is where the story stalls, not because there's nothing left to say, but because there's no trail to follow. No vehicle found, no evidence of a struggle. Her bank accounts untouched. Her apartment left intact. Even the people closest to her admit they have nothing to go on except intuition. And in a city designed to blur reality, intuition is about as reliable as a coin toss at the roulette wheel. Of course, the working theories range from mundane to monstrous. She left voluntarily. She got caught up with the wrong person. She witnessed something. She became inconvenient. There are whispers that she may have been lured into something that appeared romantic or business-oriented, only for it to turn exploitative. But again, no names, no documentation, only inference. And then, there's the shadow theory, that Cynthia wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. That her story doesn't stand alone, but slides seamlessly into a broader pattern of women drawn toward a specific kind of man, not a serial killer in the usual sense, but someone with the power to remove people from the map without leaving fingerprints, someone insulated by status, shielded by silence. It's tempting to imagine a late-night meeting in a high-rise suite, a conversation that turned cold, an exit that was never granted. But that's fiction. The truth, the real truth, is much less cinematic. It's probably boring, brutal, invisible. And yet, her name remains. Cynthia R. Jabbour, burned into the lost records of Las Vegas like a ghost that refuses to be erased. A woman who dressed for a meeting and never got to walk away from it. No scandal, no closure, just another question mark on a city skyline full of them. Still, something about her case wouldn't stay buried, because not long before her disappearance, another story was unfolding. This time, it wasn't a woman headed toward danger. It was a man, a respected executive, headed out in a beige Ford Galaxy, driving straight into the void. James Anthony Shaw. His car would be found, but he wouldn't. 2 stories in, and already, the air feels heavier. If you're still with us, that probably means you're the kind of person who doesn't mind when the answers never come. So go ahead, subscribe. These are the kinds of stories we tell here. Strange, quiet, unfinished. And while you let that last mystery settle, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Are you wide awake at noon in Texas, or half asleep at 2 a.m. in a dark bedroom somewhere? Wherever you are, don't get too comfortable. We're just getting started. James Anthony Shaw. Las Vegas is a city that doesn't care about your resume. You can be a millionaire or a janitor, a tourist or a tycoon when you vanish here. The desert makes sure everyone looks the same from 6 feet under or 6 decades later. James Anthony Shaw was not a man people expected to disappear. He wasn't an outsider. He was the establishment. In 1971, he was a 3-4-year-old casino executive, a man who had, by all accounts, done everything right. Suits tailored, hair trimmed, known in the local scene as sharp, professional, quietly ambitious. In a city where charm and corruption often go hand in hand, James was considered something of a clean operator. Not squeaky clean nobody is in this town, but clean enough to be trusted with money, power, and influence. On the 2nd of August, 1971, James left the hotel casino he managed in his beige Ford Galaxy. He was headed somewhere, but no one knows where. He never made it back. At first, no one panicked. Men in his position sometimes had private affairs, off-the-record meetings, weekend detours. He had the sort of job that came with late nights and early calls, and in 1971, people still thought men disappeared because they wanted to, not because they were erased. But it soon became clear this wasn't one of those cases. Shaw didn't check in at home, didn't show up for work, didn't access his bank accounts. His wife reported him missing. Co-workers were baffled. Friends turned to speculation, but the one clue they had was supposed to matter: his car. A beige Ford Galaxy, model year 1970. Nondescript, a common car. But in a missing person case, any vehicle is a breadcrumb trail waiting to be followed. Only, in this case, the trail went cold and stayed cold. Eventually, the Ford Galaxy turned up. Depending on which record you read, it was either discovered parked somewhere ordinary or abandoned in a way that invited more questions than answers. Regardless, it offered nothing useful. No signs of a struggle, no signs of James, not even a clear sense of when it had been left there. Just an empty car with no context. Like someone had parked it, dusted off their hands, and walked away from a life. The theories came in waves. Maybe it was a mob hit. This was Vegas in the 72nd. After all, organized crime wasn't just a conspiracy theory, it was baked into the concrete. Maybe James knew something he wasn't supposed to. Maybe he crossed the wrong line. Maybe he tried to blow the whistle on the wrong numbers. But here's the problem. There's no proof of any of that. Not even a hint. James Shaw had no record of shady dealings. No major enemies, no debts. He wasn't a big personality. He wasn't trying to play hero. He was just a man doing his job, driving a beige car into a beige sunset and never coming back. Some thought he left voluntarily, that maybe his clean image was just that, an image, that maybe he took a suitcase full of unmarked bills and disappeared south of the border. But if he did, he left no paper trail, no suspicious withdrawals, no fake passports, nothing to suggest he had the imagination or the desperation to orchestrate something so elaborate. And so the mystery remains. A man in the prime of his life, embedded in the infrastructure of Las Vegas, simply removed from the board like a chess piece, knocked over mid-game. No checkmate, no winner. Just absence. What makes his story so eerie is not the disappearance itself, but the silence that followed. You'd think a missing casino executive would warrant attention headlines, pressure, perhaps even fear. But James Shaw didn't generate the panic. He didn't spark an investigation that echoed through the years. His case became a whisper, folded into a city that already had too many. There's something especially brutal about a mystery that leaves everything behind but the person. His car was found. His job was still waiting. His house, his accounts, his suits, all remained untouched, like artifacts of a life paused in mid-sentence. All except the man himself, who walked off stage and never took another bow. And just when you think the pattern can't hold, that these disappearances must be unconnected, random, statistical, the next face appears. A young college student, full of plans and potential, in a city that never blinks. Amanda Lee Fravel. She never made it to her meeting either. But her story adds a different flavor to this spiral, not because of who she was, but because of who was waiting for her. Amanda Lee. Mandy Fravel. Amanda Lee Fravel, known to her friends as Mandy, was 20 years old when she disappeared from Las Vegas in June of 1986. She was the kind of person people remembered. Sharp-witted, sensitive, a little cautious, but brave in the ways that mattered. Originally from California, she was attending the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, studying film, chasing a future that had weight and shape and ambition. She wanted to tell stories. She didn't expect to become one. At the time, Mandy was living in an apartment near campus. It was a summer evening, hot the way Las Vegas gets in June, the kind of heat that makes time feel thick. She had plans to meet up with friends. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just a routine evening. One minute, she was preparing to leave. The next, she was gone. It wasn't like her, not to flake, not to vanish, not to just stop answering calls. Friends were concerned quickly. Her roommates were confused. She had left behind her belongings, including essentials, her identification, personal items, even the kind of shoes you don't leave the house without. All the signs pointed to an interruption, not a choice. When police were contacted, the initial response was tepid, if not outright dismissive. A young woman missing in Las Vegas? Hardly unprecedented. Maybe she left voluntarily. Maybe she was blowing off steam. Maybe she'd be back by morning. It's a script police departments have used so often it should come pre-printed on official forms. But Mandy didn't come back. Not the next day. Not the next week. Not ever. Her friends and family insisted this wasn't normal. They pushed, they called, they hung flyers, they raised money. Her case eventually made the local papers, but never with the sense of urgency it deserved. No obvious signs of foul play were found, not because there weren't any, but because nothing was found at all. And that's what makes her story so deeply unsettling. The vacuum. Mandy didn't vanish in the middle of the night while walking home through a shadowy alley. She didn't call someone crying or leave behind cryptic notes. She didn't seem afraid. There was no big fight, no final text, no dramatic gesture. She was simply there, and then she wasn't. The theories range from the plausible to the cinematic. Maybe she got into a car with someone she trusted. Maybe that person wasn't trustworthy. Maybe someone was waiting for her, someone she didn't expect. There's been quiet speculation over the years about a boyfriend or acquaintance, a potential meeting gone wrong, but nothing has ever been confirmed. No arrests, no persons of interest, just questions hanging in the air like dust in the desert Sunday. One especially chilling detail emerged later. Mandy had told a friend she'd be seeing someone the night she vanished, though she hadn't been specific. It wasn't clear whether it was a friend, a date, or someone more ambiguous. But that single comment, "I'm meeting someone," became a kind of Rosetta Stone for amateur investigators. Who was she meeting? Why didn't she mention them by name? Did she have a reason to be vague, or was it just casual shorthand? That sentence, so ordinary, so offhand, is all anyone has to work with. It has been analyzed, reanalyzed, and speculated over for nearly 4 decades, turned over in the minds of people who still wonder how someone could disappear without anyone noticing until it was far too late. What remains of Mandy's story is less a trail and more a crater. Her apartment remained untouched, her records unbroken. Her name shows up in missing persons databases, but with few details and fewer leads. Her family, heartbroken and persistent, kept pushing for answers long after the headlines faded. But the years stretched on, and eventually, even the noise quieted. Still, the feeling that her story isn't finished lingers. Maybe because she was so young. Maybe because her plans were so ordinary. Maybe because people like Mandy aren't supposed to just vanish, especially not in cities surrounded by lights, security, surveillance. But then again, Las Vegas has always specialized in illusions. And perhaps the greatest trick it ever performed was convincing us that people only disappear when they want to. Mandy didn't want to disappear, but disappear she did. And she wouldn't be the last young woman in Las Vegas to be seen stepping into the night with no return ticket. 3 years later, in a different part of the city, another woman, Brigitte Renee Mitchell, would be seen climbing into a truck with 2 men. She, too, would vanish. And this time, there were witnesses, and still, nothing. Brigitte Renee Mitchell. If you squint hard enough, the line between witness and bystander starts to blur. People see things they always do, but whether they remember them, or report them, or even believe what they saw in the first place, that's where the mystery creeps in. And in the case of Brigitte Renee Mitchell, the line was already frayed from the beginning. It was the late summer of 1999 Las Vegas. The heat hung heavy in the air, and the city was pulsing with its usual brand of rehearsed chaos, strip lights, clinking slots, traffic jams, and lives quietly unraveling just off camera. Brigitte was 23 years old, a young woman with a complicated past, which is a polite way of saying the system had already failed her a few times before she ever went missing. She was last seen at her apartment complex, not walking away mysteriously, not boarding a Greyhound to nowhere, but getting into a truck. Not alone either. 2 men were already inside. Witnesses said it was parked just outside her apartment, and she got in willingly. That word willingly gets tossed around a lot in these kinds of cases, as if it somehow carries moral weight. As if agreement cancels out whatever came next. The vehicle was described as a dark-colored truck, possibly blue, maybe black. Witnesses weren't sure. It was late. People saw but didn't pay attention. A young woman gets into a truck with 2 men. That scene plays out across apartment complexes every day without fanfare. No one called the cops. No one thought she wouldn't come back. But she didn't. That was the last anyone ever saw of Brigitte. It's the kind of detail that should have been a gift to investigators. A lead, a sighting, a license plate, something concrete. Instead, it became a dead end, paved with ambiguity. The truck was never identified. The men inside? unknown. No security cameras captured the moment. No trail of receipts, phone calls, or credit card swipes followed. Just a single sighting and then nothing. What makes her case particularly eerie is that she didn't live alone. She had a life, however fragile. A routine, a support network, people who noticed when she wasn't there. Yet the delay in reporting her missing was still long enough for the trail to grow cold. By the time law enforcement took it seriously, the scene had already disappeared into the city's ever-churning oblivion. As always, theories followed. Maybe it was a case of mistaken trust, someone she thought she knew turning out to be someone she didn't. Maybe it was transactional. Maybe she owed someone something, or someone thought she did. Or maybe she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the truck was just a convenient exit from a life she wasn't supposed to outlive. Some investigators suggested she may have had contact with at least one of the men prior to that night, someone from her neighborhood, or someone she knew through a mutual friend. But if they had names, they didn't share them. No one was ever arrested. No strong suspect ever emerged. And with no body, no crime scene, and no confession, the case never moved beyond missing. Brigitte's story eventually dissolved into the Las Vegas ether, where it joined the ranks of the city's other half-told tragedies, women who left quietly and never walked back through the door. The kind of case you stumble upon years later, tucked into an outdated online archive with grainy photos and clipped descriptions. But she was more than a file. People who knew her remember someone tough, with a dry sense of humor. She wasn't naive, she wasn't reckless, and she wasn't the type to just disappear without saying a word. Yet somehow, she did. That moment outside the apartment, the decision to step into that truck, it keeps looping like a stuck reel. Maybe it was just a ride, maybe it was something more. But in a city where truth is often negotiated, what matters most is that no one was there to stop her. No one thought it would be the last time. And if Brigitte's case felt tragically avoidable, the next one would feel even more personal. Because sometimes, it's not a stranger in a truck. Sometimes, it's your own home, your own front door, your own spouse. Just 1 year after Brigitte vanished, another woman would disappear, Everilda Duran Watson, and this time, she wasn't last seen outside. She was last seen leaving the house. According to her husband, Everilda Duran Watson, when someone disappears from inside their own life, the silence is louder. Everilda Duran Watson was 48 years old when she vanished from Las Vegas in June of 2006. By all external appearances, her life was settled. She had a husband, a home, and a routine. No tabloid headlines, no visible turbulence. But the thing about missing persons cases is that the red flags often arrive after the fact in the form of unanswered questions, contradictions, and timelines that don't quite add up. According to her husband, the story was simple. Everilda left the house voluntarily, just walked out. Took nothing with her, not her ID, not her personal items, not even the things people bring when they intend to leave for more than a few hours. It was as if she meant to step outside for a moment and never returned. But that detail alone sparked concern. Everilda was not the kind of person who left things behind. She was organized, habitual. She had medical needs that required daily attention, the kind that made sudden disappearances highly unlikely. And yet, there was no struggle reported, no witnesses. No signs of anything out of place, depending, of course, on who you ask. Her husband told police she had left on her own. He didn't seem alarmed at first. He told them she had walked out after a disagreement and hadn't come back. No violence, no threats, no big scene. Just a woman who made a decision to leave. Except that decision didn't make sense. She left behind her medication, her purse, her phone, her personal documents. She didn't contact family, she didn't withdraw money, she didn't use her credit cards. Days passed, then weeks. Still nothing. The life she had built stayed completely untouched. which meant the disappearance wasn't planned. At least, not by her. Family and friends quickly became skeptical. They described Everilda as responsible, practical, and not the type to just vanish. There were murmurs that her marriage had its share of strain, nothing that made headlines, but enough to leave people wondering. Some noted that her husband's demeanor after the disappearance was oddly calm. Cooperative? Yes, but detached, unhurried. There's a distinct discomfort that settles in these kinds of cases when the last person to see someone is also the only one with a narrative, and no one can prove it wrong. Law enforcement couldn't find evidence of foul play, but they couldn't rule it out either. There was no body, no note, no call from the road. Just a woman whose existence seemed to collapse into a single, uncorroborated statement. And that's what made Everilda's case go cold so quickly. The absence of clear evidence left investigators stranded. With no physical trail, no known location, and no obvious motive, the system defaulted to ambiguity.
Missing, not presumed dead. Not enough for an arrest. Not enough for anything.
Over the years, theories multiplied like shadows. Maybe she left of her own accord, tired of something we'll never understand. Maybe she was suffering from something silent and internal depression, stress, illness, and decided to walk away. But again, there was no record of any of that. And those who knew her best rejected those explanations outright. Others whispered that her husband knew more than he said, that the simple story he told wasn't simple at all, that the timing was off, the tone was off, and the aftermath was too tidy. But suspicion without proof is just gossip, and gossip doesn't get a search warrant. One especially curious detail emerged later, one of those throwaway comments that doesn't make sense until it's too late. A neighbor recalled hearing an argument the night before Everilda disappeared. Raised voices, then quiet. No one reported it at the time because, well, couples argue. People don't vanish every time they disagree, until they do. And that's what lingers in this story, not just the mystery of where she went, but the way everyone seemed to adjust so quickly to her absence. No major search parties, no national headlines, no breakthroughs, just a quiet disappearance and a long, uncomfortable silence. Everilda Duran Watson became another unsolved case in a city already brimming with them. Another name in a list, another photograph in a database, another woman who, statistically speaking, should have been found by now. But she wasn't. And if you think that silence is the scariest part, wait until you hear what happened just 2 years earlier. A man named Kenneth Eldon Funk, on a sunny afternoon at Lake Mead, jumped into the water to help his wife and then never resurfaced. But this time, someone saw it happen, and it still didn't help. Kenneth Eldon Funk. The desert around Las Vegas does a funny thing when it meets water it pretends to offer relief. Lake Mead, with its bright shimmer and endless, sun-blistered horizon, is one of those places that looks serene until you stare too long. Then it becomes something else entirely. Still, vast, hollow, like it's keeping secrets it never plans to give back. Kenneth Eldon Funk disappeared there in July 2004. He was 58 years old, visiting the lake with his wife on a summer afternoon that was supposed to be ordinary. A weekend boating trip, calm water, blue sky. They had launched from Colville Bay, a spot known for its scenic cliffs and postcard perfection. But Lake Mead doesn't care how your day is going. Things happen fast on open water. According to the official version of events, Kenneth and his wife were on a boat when she somehow fell into the water. He jumped in after her, not hesitating, not thinking, just reacting the way you do when someone you love suddenly isn't safe. It was a heroic instinct, a reflex. And, as it turns out, his final recorded act. What happened next is where the clarity ends. His wife was rescued, pulled back to the boat, but Kenneth never resurfaced. One moment he was above the waterline, the next he was gone. No one saw him go under. No splashing, No calls for help, no sign of a struggle, just absence. Like the lake had claimed him in a single breath and swallowed the evidence whole. Authorities responded quickly. Search and rescue teams arrived, and for days they scoured the area. Boats, divers, sonar equipment, the full protocol. But Lake Mead, vast and unpredictable, didn't cooperate. The water was deeper than expected in some parts. Visibility was poor, and sediment stirred with every movement. The currents shifted constantly. What looked like a controlled environment on the surface was a labyrinth beneath. Despite multiple searches, Kenneth's body was never found. This, unfortunately, isn't rare for Lake Mead. Its size and terrain make recovery difficult, especially when conditions aren't perfect. But what made Kenneth's case stand out wasn't just the vanishing. It was how quickly the narrative around it started to fray. At first, it was treated like a tragic accident. A man trying to save his wife. No suspicion, no foul play, no deeper angle. But over time, questions began to surface slowly, quietly. Why hadn't there been more immediate effort to secure him once he went under? How could someone disappear so completely, so instantly, in water that wasn't especially choppy or dangerous that day? If he had a medical event, a heart issue, say, wouldn't there have been some sign beforehand? Wouldn't someone have heard him call out? The authorities chalked it up to bad luck, nature's indifference, the unfortunate truth that sometimes people go into water and don't come back. But not everyone accepted that. Some noted that Kenneth had been in good health. He was active, not reckless. He'd been around boats his entire life. He knew what he was doing. He knew how to swim. It wasn't his first time on the lake. Others pointed to how quickly the accident narrative was accepted and how fast the case was marked cold. No follow-up, no autopsy because there was no body, just assumptions. There were rumors, of course. There always are. That there had been tension in the marriage, that Kenneth had financial pressures, that something on the boat hadn't gone according to plan. But again, no proof. No witnesses beyond his wife. No forensic trail. Nothing to contradict the official version, but nothing to confirm it either. And that's where Kenneth's story sits to this day. Not buried. Not solved. Just suspended. Another name on a memorial list of the vanished. Another man swallowed by the lake and forgotten by the system. If his wife knows more, she never said. If anyone else saw what happened that day, they've kept it to themselves. Lake Mead doesn't give up its secrets easily. Sometimes it does, years later, a bone here, a shoe there. But for Kenneth Eldon Funk, not even that. Just a date, a name, and a story that feels half told. But the lake didn't stop there. Because only a few months later, in almost the same area, another man would vanish. Not from the water, but from the shoreline. A truck locked from the inside, wallet and shoes left neatly in the cab. And no trace of the man who parked it. Robert C. Heisenberger. A name almost no one remembers unless you were looking very closely. Robert C. Heisenberger. Disappearance tends to follow a pattern, the kind that loops just far enough outside the lines to stay off the radar. But sometimes, when the details are too clean, too quiet, too precisely placed, you can't help but wonder, was it an accident or a message? Robert C. Heisenberger vanished in October 2004, just months after Kenneth Eldon Funk disappeared into Lake Mead. But Robert didn't vanish in the water. He vanished beside it. And that distinction, dry ground versus open lake, is what makes the whole story feel eerily surgical. Robert was 58 years old, a Las Vegas local, and by most accounts, a private man, not a recluse, just reserved. He was the kind of person neighbors described as polite but quiet, always around but never loud, the kind of presence you only notice when it's gone. He wasn't in any kind of trouble, at least, not that anyone knew. No criminal record, no major debts, no enemies that surfaced later. Just a man living a seemingly unremarkable life in a city known for everything but. And then, one day, he drove out toward the North Shore Road, a long stretch of desert highway that skirts the edge of Lake Mead. It's the kind of place people go to clear their heads, to hike, to sit in silence, to pretend the city behind them doesn't exist. On a map, it looks like nothing, just cracked roads and sun-bleached rock. But for Robert, it became the edge of the known world. His truck was found parked near one of the scenic overlooks, locked from the inside, neat, undisturbed, no signs of distress. His wallet and shoes were inside, placed in a way that didn't suggest panic or a crime of passion, just order. As if someone had been methodically erasing their presence, or someone else had arranged the scene with deliberate intent. The doors were locked. The keys were missing. There were no footprints leading away from the vehicle, no tire marks suggesting a second car had been involved. Just the truck, left like a prop on a stage after the actors have already left. Naturally, law enforcement assumed he had gone hiking, that he'd parked his car, taken off his shoes for comfort, wandered into the rocks, and never returned. That the desert, vast and unforgiving, had swallowed him whole. And while it's not impossible, it's also not convincing. Robert wasn't the sort of person to venture out into extreme desert terrain alone, without proper gear or preparation. He wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't reckless. If he went out there, he went with a purpose. And if he didn't, then someone else drove that truck, placed his items inside, locked the doors, and walked away. But if that's the case, who? The search that followed was standard protocol. Rangers and volunteers combed the area. Helicopters scanned the cliffs and crevices. Nothing. No remains. No articles of clothing. No dropped water bottles. No torn maps or dusty sunglasses. He had simply vanished from one of the most desolate and, paradoxically, most visible places in the state. One theory suggested that Robert might have taken his own life, that he'd walked into the wilderness intending not to return. But that idea doesn't sit well with the people who knew him. He had made plans that week. He hadn't withdrawn money or left behind any notes, no history of despair or illness. And even if that were the case, even if he'd walked away with finality, there would still be something, a body, a shoe, a sign. There wasn't. Another theory, more cynical, points to the convenience of the location. Lake Mead is federal land, vast, unmonitored, and silent. If someone were looking for a place to make a person disappear, this would be it. No cameras, no traffic, no noise, just sun, stone, and the occasional lost tourist. And in October, the area is especially quiet. Few visitors, fewer questions. Still, there were no suspects, no persons of interest, no suspicious behavior in the days leading up to his disappearance, no final phone call, no obvious motive. So what do you do with a mystery that doesn't even seem interested in being solved? Robert C. Heisenberger was declared missing, and his file was quietly moved into the growing stack of unsolved desert disappearances, people who walked out under the open sky and were never seen again. His name surfaces occasionally on missing persons lists, but not with urgency, just one of many. Another set of coordinates on the map of people the desert has decided to keep. And yet, this pattern was beginning to form. People disappearing not in chaos, but in eerie calm. Not in noise, but in silence. No struggle, no witnesses, just a car, a name, a gap. And that pattern would only continue. Because 3 years later, another person would go missing after a casual, seemingly harmless night out. Someone who made a phone call, promised to gamble for a few hours, and then dropped off the face of the earth. Her name was Chin Kui, and her car was found too. Chin Kui. The plans were casual. A night out, a little gambling, nothing out of the ordinary. Chin Kui, 49 years old, called her family on the 21st of March, 2007, to let them know she was heading to Binion's Horseshoe, one of the city's older, storied casinos tucked into downtown Las Vegas, where the old-school neon hums and the dice roll like they've been rolling forever. That was the last anyone heard from her. There was no urgency in her voice during that final call. No panic, no coded messages, no strange inflections. She was relaxed, if anything. People don't usually call home before walking into a trap. But Las Vegas is a city where casual plans often lead to permanent detours. The next sign of Chin came not in the form of a person, but of an object. Her car, a silver 2000 Toyota Camry, found abandoned days later, parked quietly and with no visible damage. Not at Binion's Floss, not even close. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no suspicious items left behind. Just a vehicle locked, static, silent. The kind of scene that feels like it should mean something, but doesn't speak unless someone forces it to. What made her disappearance particularly jarring is how little there was to dig into. Chin wasn't living a high-risk lifestyle. She wasn't involved in anything volatile or fringe. She had family, stability, predictability. She wasn't running from anything. She wasn't chasing some dark thrill. She was going to a casino to play cards, something thousands of people in Las Vegas do every night without incident. And yet, she vanished. Law enforcement did the standard routine. Interviews, searches, a background check that turned up nothing unusual. She had no enemies, no mysterious meetings, no gambling debts, at least none that were known. No camera footage of her arriving at the casino was ever recovered if she even made it there. That much is still unclear. What is known is that the area where her car was found was not somewhere she was known to frequent. Not near her home, not near the casino, not along any reasonable route connecting the two. And that detail alone raised every possible red flag except, somehow, not enough to spark momentum in the case. Because as with so many disappearances in Las Vegas, Chin's case didn't explode into public awareness. There was no national media blitz, no primetime pleas, no high-profile search efforts. Just a few articles, a couple of online entries, and the cold procedural voice of an official file that reads like a shrug. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't dramatic. It just didn't go anywhere. What remains of Chin's story is primarily anecdotal family members who remember her consistency, friends who were baffled by the suddenness of it all. And that's part of what makes the case so chilling. There's no downward slope here, no signs that something was going wrong, no build-up, just the ordinary flipped inside out. Her loved ones have said repeatedly that she would never have walked away from her life, that she had responsibilities she took seriously, that she was content, no history of mental illness, no signs of despair. She didn't take anything with her, not a bag, not money, not a plan, which leaves two options and only two. Either Chin-Kuei disappeared of her own volition for reasons no one can guess, or someone made her disappear. And in a city like Las Vegas, the second option is far more common than anyone wants to admit. Some have speculated about human trafficking, organized crime, or even something as simple and horrifying as an opportunistic predator. But no theory has ever been substantiated. There are no suspects, no person of interest, no usable witness accounts, no trace of her financial activity after that last call, not even an attempt to use her ID. In terms of leads, this case is a black hole. And it's not just Chin-Kuei. There's something almost architectural about how these disappearances stack. How many of them begin with a perfectly normal evening? No fight, no cry for help. Just a simple outing, a drive to a casino, a walk around the block, a dinner date that ends in total silence. 1 minute you're planning your night. The next, your car is left behind like an afterthought and your name is etched into the wrong kind of database. But Chin's case wasn't the end of the pattern. It wasn't even a pause, because just a few years later, another woman in Las Vegas would vanish without explanation. No fanfare, no known destination. Just gone. Her name was Danielle Tolliver. Her story? Even less detail and somehow even more disturbing. 7 stories in, and the pattern isn't getting clearer, it's getting weirder. If you're still here, you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. We've got dozens more mysteries just like these, and none of them come with clean endings. And while the next one loads, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it right now? Midnight in Idaho? Sunrise in Dublin? We want to know who else is wide awake, wondering where all these people went. Danielle Tolliver. Some missing person cases feel like puzzles. Others feel like erasures. Danielle Tolliver's disappearance belongs to the latter, a case where not only did the person vanish, but the surrounding narrative seems deliberately thin, as if something, somewhere, is keeping it that way. Danielle Tolliver was 38 years old when she disappeared in Las Vegas in 2016. She wasn't a tourist. She wasn't passing through on some spontaneous weekend trip. This was her city. She knew its back roads, its routines, its silences. And yet, despite being a local, despite presumably having a support network, neighbors, friends, acquaintances, her disappearance barely registered outside of a missing persons database. The official facts are scarce. She was last seen sometime in late October, though the exact date isn't always consistent across sources. She was reported missing, and that was that. No known last sighting. No confirmed timeline of events. No news conference with pleading family members. No major police appeal. No press cycle. It's as if Danielle Tolliver quietly slipped out of the margins of her own life, and no one could find the corner to fold the page back open. What we do know is limited. She was described as 5'7", 130 pounds, with black hair and brown eyes, a fairly common description in a city of over 2 million. But more importantly, she was someone who had a life, routines, and people who knew her name. That, in theory, should have been enough to trigger a proper search. Instead, the trail from the beginning was cold, not because the leads ran dry, but because they seemingly never existed. No vehicle was reported missing with her. No phone ping. No witness accounts of her leaving town or being seen with someone unfamiliar. No last text message. No financial transactions. No red flags raised at her home. Her disappearance was not connected to a known domestic dispute, a medical condition, or a mental health crisis. It simply was what it was. An absence, hollow and inexplicable. It's the sort of case that makes investigators quietly uneasy. Not because it's the loudest kind of crime, but because it's the quietest. Because when there's no story to start with, there's nothing to unravel. When someone's daily life leaves no digital or social wake, no frantic texts, no frantic family, no paper trail, the silence becomes a wall. And you realize very quickly that even in 2016, it's still disturbingly easy to fall through the cracks. In Danielle's case, the cracks looked more like canyons. There are hints, whispers, theories, all unverified, all secondhand, that she might have been struggling with something personal, that she had possibly voiced vague concerns to someone in the weeks prior, that she may have been trying to distance herself from something or someone, but those statements exist without source or citation, just fog. And in the absence of hard evidence, speculation starts to behave like fact. Her family has largely stayed out of the public eye, which has only deepened the quiet. Some have interpreted this as emotional distance or detachment. Others argue it's a symptom of a deeper tragedy that when someone is missing and no one speaks up, the silence isn't indifference, it's despair. Perhaps the most haunting part is that Danielle Tolliver's name doesn't even seem to echo. It's not quoted in long-form exposés. It's not part of conspiracy forums or message board debates. It hasn't attracted podcasters or amateur sleuths. The case doesn't even feel cold, it feels ignored. There's a term in architecture, negative space, which refers to the space around and between the subjects of an image. Danielle's disappearance is that kind of space. You can't describe what happened to her because there's nothing to describe. Only the emptiness around her absence gives you any shape at all. It's not just eerie, it's systemic. Because for every person who goes missing and triggers a media frenzy, there are dozens like Danielle. Women whose lives don't align neatly with the narratives that draw headlines. No dramatic crime scene, no tearful goodbyes, no footage, no clues, just missing. Danielle Tolliver is still listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Her case is technically open, but open doesn't mean active, and open doesn't mean hopeful. It just means unclosed, as if someone forgot to finish the sentence and everyone moved on without noticing. And as we've seen before, that silence tends to attract company. Because just a year before Danielle vanished, another woman disappeared in Las Vegas, a woman whose body was never found, whose wheelchair was left behind, whose support systems were suddenly irrelevant. Her name was Janita Gay Seitz, and her disappearance raises even more questions about how a person with limited mobility could disappear without a trace, and why no one seemed prepared to explain it. Janita Gay Seitz. Some people vanish quietly, others vanish impossibly. Janita Gay Seitz managed to do both. In 2005, Janita Seitz was 60 years old and living in Las Vegas. She wasn't anonymous. She wasn't forgotten. She was someone's mother, someone's friend, someone's neighbor. She also lived with physical limitations that made her life both difficult and deeply routine. Janita had long struggled with significant mobility issues. She relied on a wheelchair. She required medication. She had an oxygen tank. Her independence wasn't just limited. It was structured around a very specific set of support systems that made spontaneity nearly impossible. And yet, in the summer of 2005, she disappeared. No one has been able to explain how. She was last seen near her home. The details around that final sighting are unclear, which is already unsettling. Did someone see her leave? Was she inside? Outside? There's no confirmed account. Just a date, the 22nd of July, and then the silence that followed. Her wheelchair was left behind. So was her oxygen tank. So were her medications. The things she physically required just to function day to day. They were there. She wasn't. That fact alone should have exploded the case. Because if someone who cannot physically walk vanishes not in her chair, not calling for help, not packed up for a trip that leaves only one explanation, someone else removed her. But that isn't how the story played out. Instead, Janita's case quickly sank into the usual procedural murk. A missing person report was filed. A few searches were conducted. There were some efforts to track her down, but nothing that gained momentum. No suspects, no witnesses, no camera footage, no media pressure. It's as if no one could figure out how to categorize the impossibility of her disappearance, so instead they minimized it. There were no signs of forced entry. Her home or wherever she had last been didn't suggest a struggle, which makes the situation even stranger. Because even if you argue that she somehow left on her own, how would she have managed it? Where would she go? How far would she make it without her chair, her oxygen, her medications? That theory collapses under its own weight. People who knew her said she wasn't the type to vanish. She was practical. She had no plans to leave, no indication of distress or desperation, no known mental health issues that would have prompted erratic behavior. She was a woman who had built her life around making things work despite her limitations. Not the kind of person who suddenly steps out of that structure into nothingness. One of the more disturbing questions surrounding her disappearance is how long it took before people started asking it. When an able-bodied person goes missing, the idea of them getting up and walking out is more palatable. It doesn't necessarily trigger alarm bells immediately. But when someone like Janita disappears, the alarms should be immediate. She couldn't have left quietly. She couldn't have walked down the block without drawing attention. And yet, somehow, she did or was made to. There were theories as there always are, that someone close to her may have had reason to remove her, that she may have been coerced or tricked into going somewhere, that perhaps she was taken in a moment of vulnerability and never returned. But if there were people with motives, they weren't publicly named, and if anyone knew more, they never came forward. The most sinister possibility is also the simplest, that someone, knowing her limitations, knew just how easy it would be to make her disappear. Because if you remove a person who can't scream, can't chase, can't fight back, and if you do it quietly enough, it becomes less like a crime and more like an edit. Just a subtle deletion from the frame. And when there's no body, no struggle, and no evidence, that deletion becomes permanent. Because without proof, all you're left with is a name on a report and a bunch of people saying she would never just leave. But the system doesn't prosecute. Would never. Janita Gay Sites has never been found. Not a trace. No leads. Just the impossible fact that someone whose entire life depended on visible, tangible supports was somehow removed from the world without leaving a ripple. And just when you think the cases can't get more frustrating, the next one comes along, a woman named Tammy Mickey Mooney, who also walked out after a disagreement and never came back. But unlike Janita, Mickey could walk, drive, disappear if she wanted to. The trouble is, no one ever figured out whether she actually did. Tammy Mickey Mooney. Las Vegas is a city that thrives on the illusion of second chances. The next card, the next spin, the next sunrise. Tammy Mooney, known to friends and family as Mickey, was a woman who had already lived a few lifetimes by the time she disappeared. A survivor, a fighter, a woman who knew her worth and was still trying to protect it in a place that too often confuses strength with vulnerability. In October 2003, Mickey was 40 years old and living in Las Vegas. Her life, like so many others in that city, was complicated. She had been through challenges. She had relationships that were described as strained, sometimes volatile. But she was grounded, someone who worked, maintained relationships with her family, and kept in contact with friends. Her days weren't dramatic. They were lived. Then one night, after what's only been described as an argument with whom, exactly, has never been clarified, Mickey left, walked out, no suitcase, no planned trip, no indication she wouldn't be back. She simply left the house and, from the outside, it looked like she was taking a moment to breathe, cool off, gather her thoughts. She never came back. What followed was a slow unraveling. Her loved ones began calling around. Friends hadn't seen her. No one had heard from her. Her phone was silent. Days passed. Then weeks. It wasn't like her. Mickey was not someone who ghosted her life. Even when things got tense, she was a communicator. She let people know where she stood. This wasn't like her. This wasn't her disappearing for space. This was something else. The investigation that followed was, by all accounts, underwhelming. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no financial activity. Her car wasn't taken, her accounts remained untouched. Her ID was still at home. From the outside, it looked like she had stepped out for a walk and simply kept going. But the problem with that theory is that there's no evidence she even got that far. The last confirmed sighting of Mickey is unclear. There's no security footage, no eyewitness accounts, no time-stamped trail. Just a vague note that she left after an argument. That phrase comes up again and again in missing person cases. It's supposed to explain the tension, frame the exit, give us some understanding of the motive. But really, it's often a placeholder for, we don't know what happened, but something definitely did. In Mickey's case, that placeholder was never replaced. Friends and family grew frustrated with the lack of momentum. Her disappearance never made major headlines. It was the early 2000s, a time when missing adults, particularly women without the right media profile, were easily written off. She probably just left. She'll come back. People disappear in Vegas all the time. But Mickey's family knew better. She had responsibilities she didn't walk away from. She had unresolved issues she would have wanted to face. And she had people in her life she wouldn't have abandoned. What's left in the years since are more questions than answers. Was the argument with someone close to her? Did she leave voluntarily but fall into danger? Was there someone waiting outside? Someone who used the chaos of the moment to manipulate her into leaving with them? Or was it something darker, something more premeditated? One detail that came to light too late, some would argue, was that Mickey may have had a difficult relationship with someone in her life. Not necessarily violent, but controlling. The kind of dynamic that can wear a person down slowly until even the decision to take a walk feels loaded with consequence. But nothing definitive ever came of that lead. If there was a person of interest, they were never named publicly. If there were suspicions, they never rose to charges. And so, her story faded not into peace, but into bureaucracy. Another cold case in a city with hundreds, another name on a list, another woman who deserved more effort, more noise, more answers. Mickey's absence still haunts the people who loved her. Every year, her family marks the date of her disappearance, not with closure, but with a question. The kind of question that sits in your chest like a stone, that only grows heavier with time. What happened after she walked out that door? Because you don't get to rewrite the ending when the story never had one. And just when you start to convince yourself that the city couldn't possibly keep absorbing people without leaving a trace, another story surfaces, this one stranger still. An elderly woman named Opal Marie Parsons, 81 years old, who vanished in 2007. Her jewelry described in detail, her body never found. Opal Marie Parsons. In a city that forgets fast and forgives nothing, Opal Marie Parsons was an anomaly, not because she was lost, but because she should have been impossible to lose. 81 years old, medical issues, largely homebound, and yet, in the summer of 2007, Opal vanished from Las Vegas without a ripple. There's a tendency in missing persons cases to look for patterns, age groups, high-risk behaviors, troubled relationships, dangerous locations, but Opal fit none of them. She wasn't a young woman living on the edge of society. She wasn't involved in drugs, gambling, or volatile romance. She wasn't someone anyone would mistake for a target. She was, by all accounts, someone who should have been seen. A woman whose days were predictable, whose needs were numerous, whose life was shaped by routine. But the thing about Las Vegas is that it has a way of ignoring anything that doesn't shimmer. And Opal Marie Parsons never asked to shimmer. She lived alone, with assistance from caregivers and family. She had mobility issues, and it's reported she required regular medical care. The details of her final days are, as usual, frustratingly vague. One account mentions that she was last seen in her home on a quiet residential street. Another notes that she may have had a visitor or two in the days before her disappearance, but no alarms were raised right away. Not because people didn't care, but because sometimes, with the elderly, the slow quieting of a life is mistaken for privacy. The first real signal that something was wrong came when someone attempted to reach her and got no answer. Then another day passed, then another. Finally, someone arrived at her home and found it empty. No sign of a struggle, no broken locks, no overturned furniture, no dramatic clues, just gone. Her medication was left behind, her walking aids too. There was no sign she had gone anywhere on her own, no evidence she had left to run an errand or visit anyone. Her age and condition made that option laughably unlikely. But just like that, Opal Parsons was missing, and the only trace she left behind was what she didn't take with her. Perhaps the most eerie detail of her case was what was noted: the jewelry. Authorities, or perhaps family members, were quick to point out that certain items of jewelry were missing from the home. Specific pieces, described in detail. Not all of her jewelry, just some. The kind that might hold sentimental or financial value. The kind someone might pocket quickly, without much noise. That detail has never been fully explained, but it changed the tone of the investigation. Suddenly, it wasn't just about an elderly woman who disappeared. It was about why, and whether someone had come into her life or her home with an agenda. Unfortunately, like most missing persons cases involving the elderly, Opal's story didn't ignite a media frenzy. There were no nightly news segments, no press conferences with concerned detectives. Just a brief flurry of reports, a few paragraphs online, and then the long, aching quiet that follows when a case isn't sexy enough to headline. Investigators questioned friends, family, neighbors. No one saw anything suspicious. No one heard a struggle. No one remembered any unusual visitors. The assumption, unofficial, but ever present, was that someone took advantage of her. Maybe a stranger, maybe someone she trusted. Someone who knew she was vulnerable, and who knew no one would come knocking right away. But with no crime scene and no body, there was nothing to build a case on. No one was arrested, no one publicly accused. There were whispers, as there always are, that a caregiver had once seemed impatient, that someone in the family had been financially struggling, that there was tension over Opal's estate, but none of it stuck. And so, her name faded from public view. Another elderly woman who vanished not in the middle of the night, not screaming for help, but quietly, invisibly, as if she'd been lifted out of the world while no one was watching. Opal Marie Parsons remains listed as missing. No remains have been found. No suspects have ever been named. The only thing left is a list of questions no one has answered, and a few pieces of missing jewelry no one has recovered. It's hard to imagine how someone could simply remove her from her home without leaving a trace. But maybe that's the point. Maybe whoever did it counted on that disbelief, on the illusion that someone like her was too protected, too loved, too watched to be taken. But Opal was taken, and no one knows how. And just 1 year earlier, in 2006, another person walked out their door in Las Vegas, this time dressed for a hike, prepared for the sun, and carrying everything they needed for a short excursion. But like so many before them, they never came back. His name was Stephen Howard Bradley. His trail didn't end with footprints. It ended with silence. Stephen Howard Bradley. Some disappearances start with a bang, a sudden vanishing, an abandoned car, a cry for help. Others unfold with unnerving calm. Stephen Howard Bradley's case sits squarely in that second category. No chaos. No warning, just a man who went out for a hike one summer day in 2006 and never returned. Stephen was 57 years old. He lived in Las Vegas and was described by friends and family as independent, responsible, and outdoorsy, the kind of person who wasn't just familiar with nature, but respected it. Hiking wasn't a whim for Stephen. It was routine. He had the gear, the experience, and the temperament for it. He was the last person you'd expect to simply vanish on a casual outing. On the 21st of June, Stephen left home wearing hiking attire. Temperatures were rising, it was Las Vegas after all, but that never stopped him before. He was last seen near the area of Sunrise Mountain, a rugged stretch on the eastern edge of the Las Vegas Valley. Not the most treacherous landscape in Nevada by any means, but still enough of a challenge to demand attention. He didn't tell anyone exactly where he was headed, which wasn't unusual. He expected to be home later that day. He never made it. His disappearance wasn't noticed immediately. Friends assumed he was out longer than expected, but when 24 hours passed with no contact, no calls, no texts, no return concern, turned into panic. His home was checked. He wasn't there. His vehicle, eventually, was located near a trailhead, parked neatly, untouched. Inside were a few personal effects, but nothing that offered any insight into what had happened. He had clearly intended to return. Search teams were mobilized. The terrain around Sunrise Mountain was combed by helicopters, drones, dogs, and volunteers. Rescue workers searched day after day under blistering heat, navigating rocky slopes and narrow ridgelines, hoping for any sign: a piece of clothing, a footprint, a dropped water bottle. Nothing turned up. Not even a hint. For someone like Stephen, prepared, experienced, and physically fit, this made no sense. Accidents happen on trails, yes, but even in the worst conditions, there's usually something left behind. Bodies are eventually recovered. Clues surface. Stephen, on the other hand, simply disappeared into the air. Some speculated he may have collapsed from heat stroke, wandered off the trail, or had a medical emergency. But that raised more questions. Why wasn't his body found? Why didn't he radio or call for help? His phone was never located, but even if it had died, there were still areas with decent visibility where someone should have spotted him during the search. The terrain didn't cooperate, but it wasn't unforgiving enough to erase a man entirely. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into years, Stephen's disappearance remained unsolved. No evidence of foul play was ever found, but then again, there was no evidence at all. That vacuum: no body, no struggle, no resolution, left his case in a perpetual limbo. His family was left with the worst kind of burden. Not grief, not closure, but the blank space in between. They held onto the idea that maybe he was still out there, injured, confused, alive somewhere off-grid. But as time passed, even that hope began to fade under the weight of the unknown. And yet, there were things that never made sense. If Stephen had fallen or gotten lost, why didn't the search dogs catch his scent? If he had chosen to walk away from his life, which, by all accounts, he had no reason to, why go through the motions of planning a hike? Why leave his car in such a visible location? Why bring his gear? Why vanish with no goodbye? There were no financial red flags, no relationship drama, no notes, no emails. He hadn't voiced any concerns or plans that might hint at wanting to disappear. He was engaged with life, making plans for the future, attending events, staying connected. Everything pointed to a man in the middle of something, not the end of it. But this is Las Vegas, and the desert doesn't trade in logic. Sometimes, it simply decides to hold onto people, whether by accident, intent, or something stranger. Stephen Howard Bradley's case remains one of the most confounding missing persons reports in the region. Every year, hikers still pass through Sunrise Mountain, unaware that someone once walked those same trails and never came back. His name still appears in online databases, his face still shows up in age-progressed images, but his story remains paused indefinitely. And just 3 years later, another man would go missing in Las Vegas, this time not in the mountains, but walking down the street in broad daylight. A yellow jacket, a quiet exit, and another life swallowed whole. His name was Michael William Doane, and his disappearance followed the same script. No panic, no struggle, no goodbye. Just gone. Michael William Doane. Some people vanish in ways that seem almost poetic, if you can stomach the cruelty behind the elegance. Michael William Doane disappeared on the 13th of December, 2009, in Las Vegas, wearing a bright yellow jacket, as if to make himself visible in a city where most vanish in shades of gray. And yet, that unmistakable pop of color did nothing to prevent him from becoming invisible. Michael was 49 years old at the time. He wasn't transient, wasn't drifting through town. He had roots, responsibilities, and people who noticed when he was gone. Like so many of the disappeared, Michael didn't fit the narrative of someone living on the edge. He was intelligent, meticulous, and, by most accounts, deeply private. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't involved in anything dangerous. His life was steady, which is what makes the way he vanished so difficult to absorb. According to available accounts, Michael left home wearing the now infamous yellow jacket. He stepped out for what should have been a routine walk, or possibly a short errand. His neighborhood wasn't particularly dangerous. No reports of anything suspicious. No signs of surveillance footage showing anything off. He was seen walking, calm, alone. Then nothing. No one saw where he went after that. No one saw who, if anyone, he was with. His walk didn't end at a known destination. He didn't check into a hospital, didn't show up on a bus ticket roster, didn't pull money from an ATM. His phone went silent, his bank accounts untouched. No activity, no paper trail, no blip on the digital radar. He simply ceased to exist in the space between two street corners. At first, the disappearance was met with confusion. Friends and family assumed he might have taken a longer walk than expected, maybe got sidetracked, maybe had a brief medical episode and would turn up in a nearby clinic. But after 24 hours, worry set in. After 48, panic. And by the time a formal missing persons report was filed, the scent was already cold. What made the case so baffling to those close to him was that Michael wasn't impulsive. He didn't disappear for drama. He didn't make cryptic statements or hint at future absences. He didn't battle addiction or mental illness. If he had enemies, no one knew about them. If he had secrets, they were so deeply buried that no one's ever found a trace. And yet, the most jarring part of his case wasn't even the lack of leads. It was how quickly the attention faded. The yellow jacket, the only concrete descriptor, became a footnote. There were no major campaigns to find him, no nightly news cycle, no large-scale search effort. His name was added to a database, then left to sit. Another adult, missing in a city with too many of them. Another man whose last known act was utterly benign, walking out the front door. Some theories suggest he may have had a medical event, a stroke, perhaps, or sudden memory loss. But again, nothing has ever turned up to support that. Hospitals had no record of him. Nearby shelters and clinics reported no matches, and if he'd collapsed somewhere, surely someone would have found him, especially wearing something as distinctive as a yellow jacket. But nothing, not a shred. Others wonder if he met someone during his walk. A stranger, or maybe someone he knew. Maybe he got into a car. Maybe he was lured. Maybe he never meant to disappear, but someone else had planned for exactly that. The problem with these theories is that they remain pure speculation. There's no timeline to reconstruct, no last text, no final phone call, just a man stepping out into the Las Vegas air and vanishing. Michael's family hasn't stopped looking, though it's difficult to know what to look for after so many years. His disappearance didn't come with a riddle or a map, just silence, deafening silence. And the question that haunts them more than anything: how does a grown man in broad daylight, wearing a high-visibility jacket, simply evaporate? It's a question Las Vegas doesn't care to answer. In this city, people appear out of nowhere, every day, fresh off planes, out of limos, into slot machines and windowless rooms. But the reverse is true too. People vanish, quietly, elegantly, without mess, without noise. Michael William Doane is still listed as a missing person. No foul play has ever been confirmed. No closure has ever been offered. Just one more man in a city that feeds off movement who stopped moving. And then, as if to remind the world that disappearance isn't confined to any age, gender, or lifestyle, the next name on the list is a young Canadian woman. A vibrant, outspoken 1-year-old who had everything ahead of her until she, too, was absorbed into Las Vegas's black hole of the missing. Her name was Jessie Foster, and her case would become one of the city's most famous unsolved disappearances, not because it had answers, but because it had all the wrong kind of attention. Jessie Foster. In the long catalog of the missing, some names blur together forgotten footnotes in a city that forgets fast, but others refuse to fade, not because they're solved, but because they remain unresolved in full view. Jessica Edith Louise Foster, known to almost everyone as Jessie, is one of those names. She was 21 years old, Canadian, and had the kind of spark that lit up every room she walked into. Friends called her fearless, her family called her bright, strangers remembered her for her smile. She was ambitious, loved adventure, and carried herself with a confidence that came from knowing she didn't need to be saved. But Las Vegas has a long history of ignoring all of that. Jessie moved from her hometown of Kamloops, British Columbia, to Las Vegas in 2005. It was meant to be temporary, a visit, maybe a new start, depending on which version of the story you believe. What's clear is that sometime between arriving and disappearing, something changed. She began a relationship with a man named Peter Todd, a figure whose reputation quickly became a point of scrutiny once Jessie was reported missing. Her mother, Glendine Grant, has been the anchor of Jessie's story ever since launching websites, media campaigns, public appeals, refusing to let her daughter's name be buried beneath the weight of Las Vegas's disinterest. Jessie was last seen on the 29th of March, 2006. She spoke to her sister on the phone, casually, nothing alarming. That phone call, like so many in these stories, now lives in retrospective limbo. Was it a goodbye in disguise? Or just a routine check-in from someone who expected to call again soon? What we know is that she was living at a house in North Las Vegas with Todd. What we don't know is what happened after she hung up that phone. She didn't show up for her next scheduled call. She didn't respond to messages. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, Glendine contacted authorities in both the US and Canada. A report was filed. But, as always, the investigation stalled at the line where jurisdiction ends and indifference begins. When police went to the house where she'd been living, she was gone. Her belongings, toothbrush, cosmetics, clothes, hair straightener were all still there, but not her phone, not her. Her passport had never been used again. No evidence she'd left the country, no bank activity, no communication. It was like she had walked out the front door and dissolved. In the early stages, the theories came fast. That she'd been trafficked, that she'd been killed, that she'd run away, that she'd gone off the grid. But none of them held up under scrutiny. Jessie had made plans for the future. She was close with her family. She had reasons to live and people to return to. Whatever happened, it wasn't planned. Suspicion quickly fell on Todd, a man with a history of legal trouble, whose connection to Jessie was framed by many as manipulative, if not worse. He denied any involvement in her disappearance, stating simply that she left and didn't come back. Police never named him a suspect, but his name has remained a permanent shadow over the case. In interviews, Glendine has repeatedly pointed to red flags in their relationship, ones Jessie either didn't see or saw too late. Years later, tips would surface, sightings, rumors, second-hand claims that she was seen in California or trafficked through Las Vegas, but none of them ever led anywhere. Each one faded like the last, until the only thing left was the original mystery. Jessie was there, and then she wasn't. Her case has since become one of the most publicized missing person stories to come out of Las Vegas in the 2002. But notoriety hasn't brought resolution. It's only magnified the contradiction. How a woman with an entire country watching her back could still vanish without a single answer. What's worse is how Jessie's case, high profile as it is, still fits perfectly into the pattern. A young woman, last seen in a domestic space, gone without a trace, with an ex-partner who claims ignorance and a justice system that quietly lets the clock tick. Every year, Glendine marks her daughter's birthday, posts updates, and reminds the world that Jessie Foster still matters, that she didn't vanish because she wanted to, that someone knows what happened. But if the world moved fast after Jessie disappeared, it was nothing compared to what came next. Because 2 decades earlier, in the same city, another child would vanish, but this time, he was only 3 years old. His name was Francillon Pierre, and unlike Jessie, he didn't even make it past the swap meet parking lot. Francillon Pierre. 3-year-old Francillon Pierre was last seen on the 2nd of August, 1986, at a swap meet in North Las Vegas. It was the kind of outing that should have been routine, a warm weekend day, families browsing rows of dusty vendor stalls, children holding their parents' hands or darting between tables with cheap toys and sticky fingers. But by the end of that afternoon, Francillon was gone. And in the decades that followed, nothing about the case would ever become less confusing. Francillon, often called Yo-Yo by those close to him, had been left in the care of his mother's fiancé, Wilton Skip Wiltza, and his mother, Amy Leanne Robison. That alone should have been a red flag, not because of their titles, but because the couple was already under legal scrutiny at the time. Amy and Skip were facing child abuse charges related to Francillon. They'd been arrested earlier that year, and the boy had even spent time in foster care as a result. But in a twist that still stuns legal observers, the court had returned Francillon to Amy and Skip just weeks before his disappearance, a decision that now reads like a tragic miscalculation. According to their version of events, Francillon disappeared during an outing to the swap meet. One minute he was walking beside them, the next he was nowhere to be seen. There were people everywhere, vendors shouting over one another, children running in every direction. It would have been easy, they said, for him to wander off. The police were called. The search began almost immediately. But something about the story felt off. Officers on the scene noted inconsistencies in Skip and Amy's statements. The timelines didn't sync. Their responses felt rehearsed, the kind of discomfort that doesn't come from panic but from calculation. Authorities later discovered that the couple had taken a polygraph test and failed it. Not once, but repeatedly. They lawyered up quickly. Stopped cooperating. No further statements. Suspicion ballooned. The prevailing theory became grim. Francillon didn't go missing at the swap meet. He was never there. Something had happened earlier, perhaps even days earlier, and the swap meet story had been a carefully orchestrated cover. The perfect distraction in a busy, public place. But suspicion isn't proof, and with no body, no physical evidence, and no eyewitnesses who could place Francillon at the scene that day, no charges were ever filed in connection to his disappearance. Amy and Skip eventually moved to Florida, restarted their lives, and avoided further criminal repercussions. As of today, they maintain they had nothing to do with what happened. What's left is a missing child with no trace and no explanation. The kind of case that gets colder not with time, but with silence. Dozens of tips were investigated over the years, sightings, phone calls, even rumors of adoption rings. None panned out. No evidence was ever found. Francillon simply vanished from the record. And as with many missing child cases, the emotional fallout became its own form of unresolved tragedy. The foster family who had once cared for him spoke publicly about the regret they felt in not being able to protect him. Detectives quietly admitted their frustrations about a case they felt had slipped through legal cracks. A community tried to remember the boy behind the headlines, a child whose last known act was simply existing, innocently, in a place that ultimately failed him. Francillon Pierre's face was featured on age progression renderings over the years. What would he look like at 10, at 20, at 30? The images grew older while the mystery stayed frozen. A little boy who was last seen alive in 1986 remains a blank space in every database that's tried to carry his story forward. And just when you think it couldn't get more devastating, a 3-year-old lost to a system that should have protected him another child in North Las Vegas would vanish. This time a 2-year-old. Same area, same strange quiet from authorities. Different foster home, same outcome. Her name was Everlise Cabrera. She was barely walking, and then she was just gone. Everlise Cabrera. The difference between a tragedy and a mystery is what you're allowed to know. Everlise Cabrera was 2 years old when she vanished from her foster home in North Las Vegas on the 15th of July, 2006. She had been placed there just months earlier, after her biological parents lost custody due to a combination of domestic issues and welfare concerns. But Everlise wasn't forgotten. Her parents still wanted to be involved. They still asked about her, still believed there would be a path back. That path ended abruptly and completely on a summer morning when Everlise's foster parents called the police to report that the toddler was missing. No forced entry, no broken windows, no signs of struggle. She had simply disappeared from the home sometime in the early hours before sunrise. According to the couple, they woke up and discovered she was no longer in her bed. They searched the house, searched the yard, called 911. A search began immediately. Officers canvassed the neighborhood. Canines were brought in. Helicopters scanned the area. But as with so many cases before it, the result was always the same. Nothing. Her foster parents were interviewed and quickly fell under suspicion. Their timeline had holes, their behavior raised eyebrows, but as with Francille and Pierre, there was no concrete evidence, no eyewitnesses, no confession, just the awful geometry of a missing child and a locked house. The community's reaction was a mix of heartbreak and disbelief. How does a 2-year-old leave a house on her own without leaving a trace? How does a little girl just disappear from her bed in the middle of a city block without a single person hearing or seeing anything? Was it negligence? Foul play? A premeditated act carried out with disturbing efficiency? Everlise's biological parents, still fighting for custody at the time, were devastated. They had lost her once to the system, and now they had lost her entirely. Interviews from the time show their desperation, blaming the state, the foster system, and the cruel bureaucracy that took their daughter and then failed to safeguard her. There were rumors, there were theories, that she had wandered off, that she had been taken, that she had died in the home and been quietly hidden. But nothing, not a shred of evidence, has ever surfaced to support any of it. In the years that followed, the case slowly retreated from public view. The foster parents moved out of state. The home was sold. Detectives rotated out. The name Everlise Cabrera faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. Her file still exists. Her name still appears on missing children's registries. But with no leads, no forensic trail, and no new witnesses, the case has been described as inactive, pending information. And so, the system failed her twice. Once when it took her from her parents, and again when it couldn't explain what happened next. But just 1 year before Everlise vanished, another person in North Las Vegas had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. This time, not a child, but an adult man. He was last seen stepping out of a vehicle downtown. A strange location, a stranger silence. His name was Edward Allen Shea, and his story feels like the adult version of the same question. How does someone just disappear without anyone seeing them leave? Edward Allen Shea. Disappearing in Las Vegas isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a quiet moment between errands, a short drive that ends a few miles too soon. That was Edward Allen Shea in 1985, a man last seen exiting a car in downtown North Las Vegas and then never seen again. Edward was 35 years old. No criminal history, no drama, just a guy going about his life in a city where people routinely slip between the cracks. He had friends, he had routines. Nothing about him screamed, risk. And yet, on the day he vanished, he exited a vehicle, said nothing strange, and walked into a void. No one knows who was driving the car. No one knows why they stopped where they did. No one knows where Edward went after his feet touched the pavement. There are no security cameras from that era, no traffic cams, just memory. And unfortunately, memory is rarely enough. His case, like so many others from the mid-1982nd, suffered from a lack of urgency. He was an adult. He was male. He might have wanted to disappear, authorities assumed. Maybe he walked off to start over. Maybe he was tired. Maybe. But the people who knew him reject that completely. He had a job he liked. He had a dog. He had bills he paid on time. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't interested in reinvention. He was living his life. And then he wasn't. To this day, no trace of Edward Allen Shea has ever been found. His name remains on missing persons databases, but his story rarely circulates. The kind of case that becomes background noise unless someone drags it back into focus. No body, no belongings, no bank activity, no sightings. Just a man stepping out of a vehicle and into a silence that still hasn't broken. But in 2009, a similar silence would strike again in the suburb of Henderson. A man named Stephen Kocher left his car parked in a quiet neighborhood and was seen walking away, calm, purposeful, into thin air. And, unlike Edward's case, this one was caught on camera, and it still didn't help. Stephen Kocher. There's something uniquely haunting about seeing someone vanish on camera. No scream, no chase, no chaos. Just a man in a white button-up shirt and dark slacks walking across a quiet residential cul-de-sac in Henderson, Nevada, and then, nothing. Stephen Kocher was 30 years old when he disappeared on the 13th of December, 2009. His case is one of the most widely discussed missing person stories out of Nevada, not because there were too many suspects or too much evidence, but because of how cleanly the trail just ends. A man documented arriving, walking, existing, and then, at the precise moment when the footage stops, so does the narrative. Stephen was from Street George, Utah, a devout member of the LDS Church, and by all accounts, a responsible, kind, and reliable young man. He had been struggling to find stable work, bouncing between freelance jobs and short-term gigs, but no one in his life believed he was spiraling. He had plans. He was applying for work. He stayed in touch with his family. He was engaged with the world. On the day he vanished, Stephen drove over 100 miles from Utah to Henderson, Nevada. No one is quite sure why. He made stops along the way, one in Overton to buy gas, another to get food, but the purpose of the trip remains unknown. He wasn't meeting friends. He didn't tell anyone he was going. No job interview was scheduled, and Henderson wasn't a place he was known to frequent. Security footage later revealed that he arrived at a quiet residential neighborhood around noon. He parked his car at the end of a cul-de-sac, got out, and began walking, calm. No signs of being followed. No one else in the frame. He walked past a series of houses and then disappeared from view. And that was it. His car was left behind. Inside were Christmas gifts, his phone charger, and other personal items. The vehicle wasn't hidden. It wasn't ditched in the desert or abandoned on the side of the highway. It was parked neatly, as if he'd meant to come back. The mystery ignited quickly. His family reported him missing within days. Searches were launched. Volunteers canvassed the neighborhood. Police interviewed residents. No one remembered seeing Stephen after the footage. No one reported anything strange. No signs of struggle. No known enemies. No leads. His phone pinged several more times after his disappearance, including once from a tower in the same neighborhood where he was last seen. But nothing else surfaced. No purchases. No surveillance. No sightings. The man who had been captured in perfect clarity frame by frame was suddenly made of smoke. Some theorized he was lured there, that someone told him to come under false pretenses, that maybe he was meeting someone for work, for money, for help. Others wondered whether he had been struggling more than he let on, that maybe something snapped. But his bank account remained untouched. His car wasn't stolen, no evidence of foul play, no message, no hint. Just a man on camera walking towards something only he knew and never coming back. His case remains open. His family, particularly his mother, has kept the search alive for over a decade. They've retraced his steps, released documentaries, maintained websites. They've offered rewards, hired private investigators, and endured the agonizing routine of false hope every time a new tip comes in. But the footage remains the last known truth. A man walking with purpose into a world that simply didn't bother to keep him in it. And the silence hasn't ended yet. Because just decades before Stephen vanished, Another woman in Henderson would walk toward a plan she never kept. Her name was Wanda Joy Sanders. And her story is a ghost story made of real things, leases, apartments, a woman with paperwork in hand, heading toward stability. And then, silence. Wanda Joy Sanders. Wanda Joy Sanders was 34 years old in 1985. She had just relocated to Henderson, Nevada, and was in the middle of settling her life, not unraveling it. There was no chaos behind her. No drama chasing her down. She was trying to build something new, a job, a home, a fresh start. On the day she disappeared, Wanda was supposed to sign a lease on a new apartment. She was expected. She had made plans. She even had a check prepared for the deposit. She left where she was staying with all the intention in the world of coming back, but she never arrived at the appointment. That was the last confirmed act of her life, walking toward a promise of stability and not quite making it. Her disappearance was reported quickly. Friends were concerned. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't mentioned any plans to leave. She wasn't the type to flake out or disappear without a reason. She had responsibilities. She was careful. Police searched the area. They interviewed those who knew her. There was no history of mental health struggles, no abusive partner, no recent trauma. No one came forward with a sighting. No car was found, no phone records. This was 1985. Disappearances were easier then, at least for those intent on making them happen. The theory that she may have run off voluntarily never made sense. Nothing in her life pointed to an escape plan. Everything pointed to her settling in, not out. There were whispers, later, that someone had been bothering her. A man. Someone who may have been trying to interfere with her move. But that name never appeared in an official report. It was hearsay, not evidence, and nothing actionable ever came from it. The trail faded fast. She wasn't high profile. No media campaign. No America's Most Wanted segment. Just a few local news blurbs, a police file, and a devastated family left to carry a question without an answer. To this day, no trace of Wanda Joy Sanders has ever been found. No remains, no belongings, just that same vanishing point where a woman with a plan to sign a lease walked toward the future and never arrived. And then, as if the universe wanted to prove that stability itself is sometimes the most fragile illusion, another man would vanish from Henderson under equally strange circumstances, this time in 2008. A champagne-colored sedan. A quiet moment. A life paused indefinitely. His name was Richard Edward Goodwin, Jr. He said goodbye to his wife, got into a car she didn't recognize, and that was the last she ever saw of him. Richard Edward Goodwin, Jr. There's a particular kind of dread that forms when someone disappears while others are watching. Richard Edward Goodwin, Jr. was 53 years old in 2008 when he vanished from his own driveway. The story is painfully simple and endlessly troubling. His wife saw him leave the house, get into a champagne-colored sedan, and drive away. He never came back. He didn't take anything with him. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't seem distressed. He didn't pack a bag. It was the kind of departure that's not really a departure at all. Just someone stepping out for a moment. Maybe a ride, maybe a meeting, something routine. But the car he got into, his wife didn't recognize it. It wasn't his. And more importantly, she didn't recognize the person behind the wheel. That detail changed everything. Who picks up a man from his home without explanation? Why didn't Richard say anything before leaving? If he knew the person, why not tell his wife? If he didn't, why get into the car? Those questions were never answered. The sedan was never identified. No security footage, no license plate, no return. Richard wasn't in trouble. He had no known enemies, no debts. He wasn't the type to disappear. He had a quiet life, a regular schedule, and no signs that he was planning anything unusual. His family was adamant. This wasn't voluntary. Something happened. The investigation stalled almost immediately. The citing his wife's account was the only real detail, and without more information, the case went cold fast. A man leaves his house in broad daylight, gets into a strange car, and vanishes. No suspects, no trail, just one more absence in a city that doesn't keep receipts. The silence around Richard's case has only grown louder over time. He remains missing. The champagne-colored sedan remains unidentified. And the person who picked him up, if they ever existed in any official sense, never came forward. And in 2020, that silence would repeat itself again. This time, another car, another abandoned vehicle, another woman gone. Her name was Cherlyn Beardall, and her family believes something terrible happened. But as with all the others, belief hasn't been enough to bring her home. Cherlyn Beardall. When a car is found abandoned, it tells you almost nothing and suggests almost everything. In the case of Cherlyn Beardall, the discovery of her vehicle wasn't the beginning of a mystery, it was the middle of one. The part where the trail should have grown warmer, more specific. Instead, it led straight into a blank wall. Cherlyn Beardall was 40 years old when she went missing in Henderson, Nevada in 2020. She had been living in Las Vegas and was familiar with the area, with people nearby, with the roads and routines. She wasn't a tourist. She didn't just take a wrong turn. This was her home. And yet, she vanished with all the precision of someone erased. Her car, the first real clue in the case, was found abandoned near Desert Inn Road and Boulder Highway, an intersection that balances between busy and overlooked. Not remote, not desolate, but forgettable in the way 1,000 other intersections in Las Vegas are forgettable, easy to pass without remembering, which makes it a perfect place to disappear someone, if that was the goal. Her family, alarmed by the sudden silence, quickly raised the alarm. She hadn't taken her belongings. She hadn't withdrawn large sums of money. There was no indication she'd planned a trip or had an emotional breakdown. She simply didn't come home, didn't show up for work, didn't return calls. That wasn't like her. The circumstances around her disappearance remain frustratingly vague. Cherlyn was last believed to have been in contact with someone, possibly a friend, possibly an acquaintance, but the timeline is muddy. Whatever that interaction was, it didn't generate a viable lead. Law enforcement released few details, and nothing about the case ever broke through the fog of local media disinterest. Her family, however, didn't stay quiet. From the beginning, they voiced concern that Cherlyn had been taken, not walked off, not decided to leave, taken. The placement of the vehicle, the silence that followed the lack of any digital or financial trail, it all pointed toward the involvement of another person, someone who didn't want her found. But without evidence, physical or testimonial theories remain theories. The vehicle didn't show signs of a struggle. No blood, no prints, no surveillance footage of someone getting in or out. It was just parked, as if someone had carefully ended the story at that intersection and waited for the rest of the world to lose interest. As time passed, the case went cold with uncomfortable speed. No major updates, no arrests, no suspects, just one more file in a city already overflowing with unsolved vanishings. What haunts her family most is the lack of official traction. The way her case faded, not because it lacked heartbreak, but because it lacked spectacle. No camera footage, no high-profile connection, no dramatic clues. Just a woman who was here and then wasn't, and a car that told them nothing. Cherlyn Beardall is still missing. Her family still searches. Her story still floats in the current of so many others, suspended in that uncanny space where people vanish in the middle of everything. Not in remote forests or far-off countries, but right here in a city that pretends it's always paying attention. And from here, we move north out of Henderson and Las Vegas entirely to Reno, where the air is thinner, the silence is sharper, and the disappearances somehow feel colder. It begins with a woman named Star Michelle Palumbo, whose vanishing was preceded not by conflict, but by confusion. She was disoriented, they said. She wasn't acting like herself. And then she walked out the door. Star Michelle Palumbo. There's a certain cruelty to the kind of disappearance that comes wrapped in ambiguity, where the line between choice and compulsion isn't clearly drawn. Where a person seems slightly off, not broken, not panicked, just distant and then disappears. That was Star Michelle Palumbo in 2000. Star was 25 years old, living in Reno, Nevada, and by all accounts was intelligent, driven, and deeply loved by her family. But shortly before she vanished, something changed. According to reports, Star had started exhibiting signs of confusion and disorientation. Her behavior, while not aggressive or overtly alarming, had become erratic enough for loved ones to take notice. On the 13th of March, 2000, Star reportedly left her home in this state, confused, unsure of herself, possibly distressed. She was last seen walking alone, no confirmed direction, no known destination, no explanation. What makes Star's disappearance particularly difficult to dissect is that she may have been struggling with undiagnosed or untreated mental health issues at the time. Her behavior had changed recently, and while she hadn't been violent or threatening, she didn't seem entirely like herself. Family members later described the weeks leading up to her disappearance as strange. Her decisions, her comments, her body language, they all suggested something was off, but not dangerous. Not enough to warrant serious intervention. Just enough to raise that faint warning bell that so often gets ignored until it's too late. She was last seen in Reno's downtown area, a place that, in the early 2000s, was a patchwork of casinos, motels, and low-traffic streets. The kind of place where someone could walk through a crowd and vanish without even being noticed. Surveillance cameras were fewer, documentation was thinner, and Star, for all her visibility, simply melted into the cracks. When her family realized she was missing, they began the desperate process of backtracking, calling hospitals, shelters, jails, any place that might have taken in a confused young woman who couldn't fully explain who she was. But nothing came back. No admissions, no arrests, no sightings. Over the years, the theories have been both tragic and predictable. That she had a mental health crisis, wandered into the wilderness, and succumbed to the elements. That she was taken in by someone who offered help and exploited her instead. That she suffered a medical emergency and was never found. But no physical evidence has ever emerged to support any of it. And as time passed, people began to speculate in darker directions. That someone saw her disoriented state and used it as cover. That someone may have taken her not because she was a target, but because she was vulnerable. And in that window of vulnerability, all it took was one person making the wrong decision. Star Palumbo remains missing to this day. Her case has been reopened multiple times, with tips investigated and dismissed, leads drying up as quickly as they appear. Her family has never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped wondering how someone so vibrant could become so invisible. And just 6 years later, another woman would disappear from Reno in a way that would deepen the mystery even further. Not a woman in crisis, not someone visibly vulnerable, just someone out for a drive on Valentine's Day. A mother, a teacher. Her name was Judith Ellen Cassida, and her car would be found in the exact place. Another famous Nevada disappearance occurred at the exit to nowhere near Winnemucca. Judith Ellen Cassida. There are places in the world that seem to hold on to people. Highways where the wind shifts wrong. Rest stops that echo too quietly. Exit ramps that don't lead anywhere. For Judith Ellen Cassida, that place was Interstate 80, east of Reno, Nevada, near Winnemucca, near silence, near nothing. On the 14th of February, 2006 Valentine's Day, Judith left her home in Reno and headed east in her white Ford Ranger. She was 59 years old, a mother, a school teacher, someone who lived her life with purpose and predictability. She had no known enemies, no financial drama, no history of instability. This wasn't a woman looking to run. This was a woman going somewhere. The problem is, no one knows where. She told no one about the trip. She didn't mention plans to leave the city. Her routine was not one that typically involved long-distance driving alone, especially not on a remote stretch of Nevada desert highway. But that morning, she got in her truck and drove east. Several days later, her vehicle was found abandoned at an off-ramp near Golconda Summit Exit 205, a place not known for much of anything, unless you count dust and mystery. There was no note, no sign of a struggle. The truck wasn't crashed or vandalized. It was just left there, as if the driver had intended to return any moment. This exit would later become even more infamous when, in 2011, another missing person, Pat Carnes, would have his vehicle found in the exact same spot. But in 2006, Judith's case was strange enough on its own. Inside the truck were her personal belongings, including her purse, Idaho, and other items suggesting she hadn't been planning to disappear. The engine wasn't running, the doors were locked, and she was gone. Search crews combed the area surrounding Exit 205 for days. It's desolate, but not endless. Brush, hills, rocky terrain, nothing turned up, no footprints, no discarded items, no body. Nothing to suggest whether Judith had walked away from the vehicle or been taken from it. Her family was stunned. She wasn't impulsive, she wasn't known to take risks, and most importantly, she hadn't told anyone where she was going, not her children, not her co-workers, not her friends. It was as if the journey had been meant only for her, and whatever it was, it ended on the side of the highway. Was she meeting someone? Was she running from something? Did she get lost? Was she led there? The theories are endless, but none of them fit. One curious detail that emerged later, more rumor than confirmed fact, is that Judith had mentioned feeling uneasy in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, that she'd seemed distracted, that she had expressed concern about something, but those who knew her disagree on what that meant. No threats were reported, no legal issues. If she was afraid of something, she didn't say what. Her disappearance has drawn comparisons to several others along I-80 enough to fuel talk of a possible pattern, a serial predator, a place with a reputation for attracting the wrong kinds of stories. But again, nothing conclusive. No evidence linking her case to anyone else's cast. No solid suspects. Just timing and coincidence. Judith Ellen Casita has never been found. Her disappearance remains one of the most quietly baffling mysteries in Nevada. And for those who still remember her, the most unbearable detail is this. She vanished on Valentine's Day. A date most people associate with love, with safety, with home. She left in the morning light and never walked back into her life. And then there's the part you can't ignore. The exit where her truck was found. Exit 205. The same spot where, years earlier, a man named Pat Carnes would vanish. But before him, there was someone else who disappeared closer to Reno. A woman with a long list of aliases. A woman known more for who she may have been than for how she vanished. Her name was Mary Elizabeth Liz Carter, and her life was a puzzle even before she became a missing person. Mary Elizabeth Liz Carter. Some people go missing in a single moment. Others take years to disappear. Mary Elizabeth Liz Carter was a woman already living in fragments by the time she vanished in 1984. She was 60 years old, living in Reno, and known to operate under multiple identities, not as a criminal, necessarily, but as someone who kept parts of herself sealed off. Liz Carter wasn't just a missing person. She was a question mark with legs. Little is known about her personal life before her disappearance. Public records are thin, family connections unclear. What does stand out is the paper trail. Aliases, addresses, and the faint outline of someone always one step ahead of definition. Not quite a fugitive, not quite free. She disappeared in late spring, under circumstances that have never been publicly clarified. No confirmed last sighting, no known destination. It's not even clear who first reported her missing. One version says it was a friend. Another says it was a former landlord. Either way, the alarm wasn't raised quickly, and by the time anyone noticed Liz was gone, she'd already been missing for days, possibly weeks. There was no abandoned car, no signs of a break-in, no suitcase, just absence. That fact alone makes her case especially difficult to analyze. There are no starting points, no trajectory, just the knowledge that one day she was there, and then she wasn't. In a town like Reno, where lives drift in and out like weather, that kind of silence is easy to miss. The idea that Liz disappeared by choice is hard to shake. Her use of multiple names suggests a desire to remain untraceable. She may have had a reason to vanish, a motive, a fear. But if she walked away, she left no clue behind to explain why. And if someone else removed her from her life, they did so with uncanny precision, leaving no forensic evidence, no crime scene, no financial disruption. Her bank accounts were untouched. Her apartment, if she had one at the time, offered no clues. Even the aliases are a mystery. Some were confirmed, others were likely self-created. She may have been traveling under a name no one ever learned, which makes databases and facial recognition software largely useless. Without a fixed identity, it's hard to trace a path, and even harder to confirm a body, should one ever be found. Was she hiding from someone? Was she trying to start over? Was she fleeing a past that finally caught up with her? We don't know. We only know that she stopped answering the door, that her trail ended somewhere in Reno, that her name, however real or false it was, eventually landed on a missing persons list. Mary Elizabeth Carter has now been gone for over 40 years. No sightings, no confirmed communications, no family coming forward to claim her as their own. Just a strange footnote in a city already full of unsolved exits. But even her story wasn't the last from that area, because a decade later, in 1994, another young woman would go missing from Reno. Her name was Jill Christine Beatty, 24 years old, hearing impaired, and full of potential. And like so many others in this strange series, she simply vanished into an ordinary day. Jill Christine Beatty. There's a particular cruelty in a disappearance that comes without spectacle. No strange car, no final phone call, no sign of conflict. Just a young woman who stepped into the quiet current of a Reno day in 1994 and was never seen again. Jill Christine Beatty was 24 years old when she vanished. She was hearing impaired but highly independent, smart, determined. She had studied computer programming and dreamed of doing work that combined structure with creativity. She lived alone in Reno at the time of her disappearance, balancing a job and the day-to-day rhythm of her early 20s. Nothing in her life seemed chaotic. There were no signs of danger. She wasn't drifting. She was trying to build something. And then she was gone. The exact date of her disappearance is uncertain. What's known is that she was last seen in the late summer of 1994. Her absence wasn't noticed immediately, a common theme in missing adult cases, and by the time friends and family raised concerns, the timeline had already started to blur. Had it been days? A week? She had missed work, missed check-ins, missed life, and that wasn't like her. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle. Her car was still there. Her possessions were untouched, but she was not. No note, no calls, no withdrawal from her bank account. It was as if she had been plucked from the world with surgical precision. The search that followed was frustratingly slow. Authorities issued alerts, contacted nearby agencies, followed standard protocols, but nothing surfaced. Jill had no known enemies, no history of mental health issues, no documented plans to leave town. Her disappearance had no logical starting point. One possible theory that circulated quietly, and mostly among locals, was that someone had targeted her specifically because of her hearing impairment. Not because she was weak, but because she might not have heard someone approach, might not have heard a door open, might not have sensed the warning signs others take for granted. But even that, disturbing as it is pure speculation. No suspects were ever named, no witnesses came forward, no belongings were recovered in nearby areas. Jill had simply disappeared in the city she called home. Her family continued to search. Flyers were posted, tips chased. A few leads trickled in. Someone thought they saw her in a store. Another claimed she had been spotted near a rest stop. None of them held up. The silence hardened. And over the years, her name faded from memory. She became another face on another page in a binder of open cases. No anniversaries covered in the media. No annual reminders. Just a name, a birth date, and a final question that's never been answered. Jill Christine Beatty remains missing to this day. Her story didn't generate headlines or documentaries, but it left behind a vacuum, the kind only her return could ever fill. And as with so many before her, the most unsettling part is not the strangeness of her disappearance, but the stillness that followed. No noise, no chaos, just a life that stopped being lived. And if Jill's disappearance left behind too few clues, the next one in line came with just enough detail to haunt. Because in 1983, a 10-year-old boy in Lemon Valley was walking to school and simply never arrived. His name was Anthony Bernard Franco. And the last person to see him described a rusted car, and then nothing. Anthony Bernard. Tony Franco. The walk to school was short, less than a mile. Tony Franco had done it many times before, but on the 30th of September, 1983, something interrupted the routine, and he was never seen again. Anthony Bernard Franco, known affectionately as Tony, was a 10-year-old boy living in Lemon Valley, a quiet, suburban stretch just north of Reno. He was a fifth grader. Energetic, social, small for his age. That morning, he left home on foot as usual. It was a normal day, a normal route. He should have arrived at school before the first bell. He never did. The alarm was raised quickly. Teachers noticed his absence. His parents confirmed he had left for school. Police were called. The search began almost immediately. And then a witness came forward, a neighbor who had seen Tony that morning, just minutes after he left home. According to the account, Tony had been seen near a rust-colored vehicle parked along the road. There may have been someone inside. The neighbor wasn't sure. What they remembered was the image of Tony slowing down near the car, maybe to talk, maybe to look, and then he was gone. That small detail, the rusted vehicle, became the cornerstone of the investigation. Police canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone recognized the car. They didn't. No other witnesses reported seeing it. No camera footage existed in the area. And no physical evidence ever tied the car, or anyone associated with it, to Tony's disappearance. The case gained significant attention in the region. A missing child, last seen on his way to school. In broad daylight, it struck a nerve. Flyers were posted everywhere. Parents were warned to keep their children close. But weeks turned into months. The leads ran dry. Tony's family was devastated. His parents cooperated fully, held press conferences, begged the public for information. They never gave up hope, but that hope was never rewarded. Over the years, various theories were proposed: that the person in the car had offered Tony a ride, that he had known them, that something had been planned, or worse, that it was completely random. None of these theories ever produced a result. No suspects were ever formally charged. No remains were found. The case still sits open in the missing children's files, haunting and unresolved. And as if echoing some cruel symmetry, just 4 years later, another child, this time a girl, also from Lemon Valley, would go missing on her walk home from the 7-Eleven just 5 minutes away. Her name was Jennifer Lee Martin. she was 11, and like Tony, she never made it home. Jennifer Lee Martin. Some walks are too short to allow for something to go wrong, and yet, something did. Jennifer Lee Martin was 11 years old when she vanished on the 28th of June, 1987, while walking home from a nearby 7-Eleven in Lemon Valley. It was a hot summer afternoon, and the store was just a few blocks from her house. She went in to buy something, a snack, a soda, maybe both. She left. She never arrived home. That's the story. That's all of it. Witnesses confirmed she had been at the store. Some remember seeing her leave. Others didn't notice which direction she went. She was alone. She didn't seem distressed. No one reported seeing a vehicle nearby. No one heard a scream. It was as if the short distance between the 7-Eleven and her home folded in on itself, swallowing her whole. Her parents reported her missing quickly. Police launched a full investigation. Search teams combed the neighborhood, nearby fields, drainage areas, sheds, nothing. No items dropped. No scent trail for dogs. No signs of struggle. Just absence. And if it all sounded eerily familiar, it's because it was. 4 years earlier, almost to the day, Anthony Tony Franco had vanished from the same neighborhood under near identical circumstances. Both cases would eventually be considered possibly linked, at least unofficially. The proximity, the timelines, the complete lack of evidence, but no suspect was ever arrested in either. No forensic connection has ever been established. Just the weight of 2 missing children from the same neighborhood, lost within walking distance of their own homes. Jennifer's family never stopped looking. Her photo has been age-progressed multiple times. Each version shows a different possible future. All of them incomplete. Like Tony, she remains a child in memory, fixed in time, frozen at the age she was last seen. And just a year before Jennifer disappeared, another local adult would vanish not from Lemon Valley, but from Reno itself. His name was Leo Edward Mispagel. A 7-year-old man. No drama. No conflict. Just one more person who didn't make it home. Leo Edward Mispagel. Disappearances tend to follow an eerie rhythm. The vanishing of the young, the vulnerable, the impulsive. But Leo Edward Mispagel didn't fit into any of those boxes. He wasn't a child. He wasn't unstable. He was 57 years old, lived in Reno, and, as far as anyone knew, had no reason to simply walk away from his life. And yet, in the summer of 1986, Leo did exactly that. Or rather, something or someone made it look that way. The details of Leo's disappearance are sparse, frustratingly so. He was last seen sometime in late July, but the exact date has never been firmly pinned down. The people in his life assumed things were normal. He went to work, paid his bills, followed a routine that rarely wavered. There were no indications of distress or struggle. Nothing to suggest that he was planning a departure of any kind. But when Leo missed a scheduled meeting with a friend, concern began to grow. That concern turned into worry when calls to his home went unanswered. Eventually, someone checked in, and Leo was gone. His apartment was quiet. His vehicle, if he had one at the time, was unaccounted for in early reports. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, no farewell note. His belongings were mostly intact, and nothing seemed obviously stolen. The police were notified, but there was little to work with. Leo wasn't known to be involved in anything risky. No gambling debts, no criminal activity, no family disputes. He was a quiet man with a quiet life. He simply vanished. The investigation sputtered from the start. With no witnesses, no timeline, and no evidence of foul play, the case never picked up steam. He wasn't famous, and his disappearance didn't trigger the kind of media attention that might have kept his name in the public consciousness. As far as the system was concerned, Leo Mispagel was just one more adult who had the legal right to walk away, even if that assumption made no sense to the people who knew him. What's particularly haunting about Leo's case is how it seems to have been swallowed up by silence. Even his public records, old database listings, reports from local papers are minimal. It's not just that he vanished. It's that so much of the story around his vanishing also evaporated. No interviews with desperate relatives. No strange new theories years later. Just a man who lived and then didn't. There's a theory, whispered by locals and passed down by amateur sleuths, that Leo might have witnessed something he wasn't supposed to, that he overheard a conversation or stumbled upon something inconvenient. But that theory, like all the others, is built entirely on air. No body has ever been found. No confirmed sightings have ever surfaced. His case remains open, inactive, and unresolved, one more entry in a ledger of lives suspended in mid-motion. And if Leo's story feels like the beginning of a trend, it's because it was. By the early 2000s, Reno was already home to a strange pattern of disappearances, not dramatic, not cinematic, just quiet. The kind of vanishing that leaves only a dent in the air. Which brings us to Jeanette Maria Corpuz, a woman whose story was the opposite of silent, because when police entered her home, they didn't find a mystery. They found blood. Jeanette Maria Corpuz. There's a category of disappearance that starts after the violence ends, the cleanup stage, the story that's already happened, with the victim still missing, and only the aftermath left to piece together. Jeanette Maria Corpuz was one of those stories. In 2003, Jeanette was 29 years old and had recently remarried. She lived in Reno with her new husband, Mario, and by all external appearances, things were going well. She was known to be responsible, social, and attentive to her family. She didn't drink heavily, didn't stay out late. Her life had rhythm. But sometime in early April of that year, Jeanette vanished. No warning, no public scene. She stopped responding to calls, stopped showing up, stopped existing. Concerned relatives eventually contacted law enforcement, who conducted a welfare check. What they found wasn't ambiguity, it was blood. Reports say blood evidence was discovered in Jeanette's home, enough to raise alarms, enough to suggest something violent had occurred, but not enough, apparently, to move the case beyond suspicion. Mario, her husband, cooperated at first, gave statements, told police he hadn't seen her, said she had left. Maybe angry, maybe confused, maybe she'd come back. But something about his demeanor didn't sit right with detectives. And then, months later, Mario died. Suicide. No confession, no note. Just another vanishing point in a story full of them. The implications were obvious, but implications aren't evidence. Police couldn't conclusively tie Jeanette's disappearance to Mario's death. No body, no witnesses. Just the bloody aftermath and a man who took whatever truth he had with him. Over the years, the case has remained open. Her family has pushed for renewed attention. But without a living suspect and without forensic confirmation, Jeanette remains one of Reno's most unsettling unsolved cases. A woman who likely died violently, but whose final resting place remains unknown. And then there's the location, Reno, again. And it wouldn't be the last time a young woman disappeared in connection with I-80, that long, strange highway that cuts through the Nevada desert like a blade. In 1987, another woman would vanish just outside of Wells, a hitchhiker, a road trip, a promise of adventure. Her name was Stephanie Kelly Stroh, and her disappearance may have intersected with something much darker. Stephanie Kelly Stroh. There's a kind of mythology around hitchhiking. Freedom, youth, trust in strangers. Stephanie Kelly Stroh bought into that mythology, and for a time, it bought her adventure. Until it didn't. Stephanie was 21 years old in 1987 when she set out on a cross-country trip that would take her through the Nevada desert. She was from Montana originally, an intelligent and spirited young woman who had grown up exploring the West. She was educated, intuitive, and known to be both cautious and idealistic, a tough combination to carry into the wilds of the American highway. She had been traveling for weeks before she disappeared. Hitchhiking was part of the plan. She kept in touch with her family by phone and letters. And on the 15th of October, she was last seen near Wells, Nevada, near Interstate 80, the same lonely road that has quietly devoured more people than it should. She had reportedly stayed at a local motel and was possibly seen in a diner. She told someone she planned to head west, maybe toward California. That was the last trace of her. Her backpack was found days later abandoned, but still packed. No wallet, no ID, just clothes, notebooks, and the debris of a life in progress. From the beginning, there were whispers that Stephanie might have crossed paths with a serial predator. The Nevada desert had, by the late 82nd, become a dumping ground for long-haul killers, men who moved invisibly between states, collecting victims along the interstate like stamps. It's never been confirmed, but many believe Stephanie was one of them. A man named Roy Melanson, a known serial offender, was once named a person of interest, but no charges were filed. And while Stephanie's story appeared on television crime shows and in investigative specials, no definitive evidence ever surfaced. No body, no confession, just a young woman who stepped out of a motel and into a car that no one can identify. Her parents never gave up hope. Her name stayed in the headlines longer than most, but with every passing year, the lines blurred. What she looked like, what she might have become. The specifics of the last known day. Stephanie remains missing, and somewhere along the desert spine of I-80, her story continues to echo one more voice in a place built for silence. And 4 years after Stephanie vanished, another traveler would disappear on that very same stretch of highway. His name was Patrick Francis, Pat Carnes. He wasn't a hitchhiker, he was a retiree. He had a car, a dog, and a plan to drive home. He made it all the way to exit 205, then stopped like Judith Casita had 5 years before, and was never seen again. Patrick Francis. Pat Carnes. If you were to draw a circle on a map of northern Nevada, somewhere around exit 205 off Interstate 80, it would cover a lot of dirt, a lot of dust, and a lot of unanswered questions. This is where Judith Casita's truck was found in 2006. It's where Stephanie Stroh vanished nearby in 1987. And in 2011, it became the last known location of an 86-year-old man named Patrick Francis Pat Carnes. He was last seen at night. On the 13th of April, 2011, Pat and his little dog, Lucky, were driving westbound through Nevada. They were heading home to Reno after visiting family in Ohio. It was a long trip, but not unusual for Pat. He was retired, independent, and confident on the road. He enjoyed travel. The route was familiar. Earlier that evening, Pat was stopped by a Nevada Highway Patrol officer near Wells. His vehicle, a green Subaru station wagon, had been following a semi-truck a little too closely. Nothing aggressive. Nothing strange. Just a routine traffic stop, the kind you forget about 5 minutes later. The officer chatted with Pat. Everything seemed fine. He was polite, articulate. No signs of confusion or impairment. He mentioned that he was headed home. The officer let him go with a warning. That was around 9 p.m. And that was the last time anyone ever saw him. The next day, Pat's car was found 70 miles away, abandoned in the middle of Pumpernickel Valley, just off. Exit 205. The vehicle wasn't wrecked. It wasn't hidden. It was stuck high-centered on a gravel service road, like someone had tried to turn around and misjudged the terrain. The engine was off. The keys were still inside. Lucky's dog bed and leash were there. But Lucky was gone. So was Pat. The car didn't show signs of struggle. There was no blood, no broken glass, no signs of a crash. It wasn't looted. Pat's wallet, Idaho, and credit cards were all accounted for. But there was no indication of where he had gone, or why he had stopped in such a remote area. To this day, it's unclear what route Pat took after his traffic stop. There were no confirmed sightings, no surveillance footage. Authorities reviewed GPS data from nearby trucks, re-interviewed the trooper who stopped him, and canvassed the area with helicopters and search dogs. Nothing. It was as if he and his dog had simply stepped out of the car and vanished into open space. And here's where it gets strange. This stretch of I-80, particularly between Wells and Winnemucca, has quietly collected vanishings for decades. Pat wasn't the first person to disappear near exit 205. Judith Casita's vehicle was found at the same off-ramp 5 years earlier, and Stephanie Stroh's last confirmed sighting placed her not far from that exit. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you start seeing the same coordinates show up again and again, patterns start to form. Patterns the road doesn't explain. Pat's disappearance didn't stay quiet for long. His age, the bizarre circumstances, and the eerie connection to prior disappearances drew media attention. Interviews with his daughter painted a picture of a man who wasn't confused, wasn't lost, wasn't running. He was just gone. Investigators explored all the usual avenues. Foul play? Possible. Voluntary disappearance? Highly unlikely. Wrong turn? It didn't make sense. Pat had driven this route many times before. He wasn't the type to experiment with side roads at night. And even if he had gotten stuck, why leave the car with no attempt to get help? Why not call someone? One theory suggests that he may have accepted help from someone, perhaps the truck driver he'd been following. But that truck was never identified. No other drivers came forward. There was no dash cam, no CB chatter, nothing to trace. Another theory, more unsettling, is that someone lured him off the road intentionally, that the gravel service road he ended up on wasn't a mistake, it was a trap. It's a theory with no proof, but one that has grown legs in the absence of anything better. Then there's Lucky the dog. Search teams never found the dog, dead or alive. No tracks, no sightings, no remains. For some, this is the most haunting detail of all. Dogs don't just disappear quietly. If Pat had passed away in the open, Lucky would likely have stayed close, barked, wandered into the road, something, but nothing. Both man and dog were erased. Today, Pat Carnes remains missing. Lucky remains missing. And exit 205 remains an unresolved knot of tragic symmetry. 3 people vanished in or near that exact area over 3 decades. 3 people who were all headed somewhere. 3 stories with the same ending. Silence. There's a stretch of asphalt in the Nevada desert that holds more questions than answers, and the wind doesn't talk. Maybe it never will. But the mystery of Pat Carnes is where this particular journey ends. Not because the questions have been answered, not because the trail makes sense, but because, at some point, the road goes quiet, and all you can do is look back and ask the same question over and over again. Where did they all go? Because what began as 33 stories about the missing people of Idaho, Las Vegas, Reno, and the lonely edges of the West ended in the exact same place it started, with someone still missing.